Following is a conversation with Chris Frith, British psychologist, Professor Emeritus at University College London. Chris is one of the pioneers of using neuroimaging in studying mental disorders, as well as one of the first developers of Bayesian modeling in psychology. In this conversation, we discuss a relationship between brain and culture, how interaction between brains creates human culture. In second part, we discuss a relationship between culture and mental disorders. And finally, we discuss two of the most prominent theories of consciousness, global neuronal workspace and integrated information theory. Enjoy the conversation. So thank you for agreeing for another interview. In our previous interviews, we mainly discussed consciousness at individual level. Yes. In this interview, I would like to more extend to other levels of hierarchy, specifically how brains interact to create culture and institutional facts. We live in two kinds of facts. We have two kinds of facts. For example, like physical facts. Atom of hydrogen has one proton, and other kind of facts like marriage, citizenship, institutions that does not have any physical substrate, but also they act as if they were objective facts. They causally influence our behavior, and it is interesting how predictive processing framework could explain this.
I think one of the most interesting things that I'm trying to study at the moment is how people interact with each other, and through their interactions create a sort of culture. And I guess what I mean by culture in this case is having models of the world. And of course, as you were just saying, that these could be models of the physical world, like, that we're built up of atoms and molecules and so on, but also models of what we might call the mental world, which includes, say, legal systems, ideas about what freedom is, and so on. And I think the basic mechanism is the same for both these kinds of models, but the results are obviously somewhat different. And going back to consciousness, I think what is interesting particularly about human consciousness, is that we not only have subjective experiences, but we can talk about these subjective experiences to other people. And what we say has influences in both directions. And this, in fact, corresponds to what Dan Sperber long ago said about culture, that it depends on two processes. One is that individual cognitive experiences are put out into the world of other people, so we tell other people about our experiences, and this changes other people, and then there's an opposite route, which is other people, including culture more generally, has an effect on the way my cognition and brain works, if you like. And in regard to the physical world, you could say this is basically how science works, that we develop ideas about how the physical world works, what it's composed of. We share these ideas and we make predictions about the physical world, which are on the basis of which we can update our models. And in some sense, our models of the physical world get more and more accurate in terms of prediction, although they never stop. There's no ultimate truth that we're going to get to. And I think in a similar way, we have models of the mental world. So, for example, there's something known as folk psychology, which is about, in a sense, about how our minds work. So we say that people act on the basis of their beliefs and desires. So if I can work out what your beliefs and desires are at this moment, I can to some extent predict what you're going to do next. And what is interesting about this kind of modelling is that this model may or may not be accurate about how the mind works, but it's extremely useful, because if I believe that people's behaviour is based on their beliefs and desires, that also determines how I behave, because I think I'm going to behave on the basis of my beliefs and desires. So it actually makes it easier to understand each other as long as we have the same model, even if the model is wrong. And I think that's perhaps the difference from the physical world, where in fact you can say the model gets better and better, but in the mental world we can have different kinds of models, and people in other cultures may have different models about how the mind works, which is fine and enables them to get on with each other. And the problem is when the cultures meet and they have different models, then we may have misunderstandings at the least. And in terms of predictive coding, as I say, these models, whichever kind of world you're dealing with, happens in the same way. We make predictions, we see what happens, we update our models on the basis of that. So that's a very rough account of...
Is it related to more metacognitive abilities?
I think it must be, although there's not much work on this yet. We assume that if you are better at introspecting about your situation, you will have a better model and you'll be able to explain yourself better to other people, and vice versa. There's certainly some evidence. So, I mean, the very simple version of this, experiments that I was involved with, is two people working together. They have to make a decision. And in our experiment, the decision was about some rather simple visual signal that was difficult to detect. So each of them looks for the signal, and each of them says, was it there or was it not there? And when they work together, we find what they typically do is they tell you about their confidence. How sure am I that I saw the signal? And they would typically choose the answer of the more confident person. And in most cases, this is successful in the sense that the two people working together can make better decisions than the better one working on their own. But this depends on being able to accurately say how confident I am in what I saw. And you get interesting problems arise. So you might get a problem because some people are overconfident consistently and some people are underconfident consistently. And you might expect if they work together, you'll put too much weight on the overconfident person, so you won't get the advantage. But it turns out that in practice, when two such people work together, they align the way they talk about their confidence. So the overconfident person becomes less confident and the underconfident person becomes more confident, so that they actually do benefit in most cases. This is messed up if you give one of them testosterone when they become completely confident and ignore the other person altogether. But there are other problems, like if the two people are not equally competent, if one of them is good at it and one of them is bad at it, if you don't know that, you'll put too much weight on the person who's not very good at the task. So you have to have this, that's where you have to not only know about your own abilities, but you have to know about other people's abilities as well. And this, I think, has interesting implications for any sort of group endeavour. But that's where metacognition comes in at a very simple level. And I guess in science you can have some people who are very confident in their models and other people who are less confident, and that might cause problems, but at least you have evidence that you can bring to bear.
There is a big emphasis on evolutionary story of consciousness and genetics. And we know much more about that than interactions between brain and culture. Because like in genetics and how genes influence brain, we can talk about specific physical substrate, genes, molecules of DNA. But in case of culture, there have been some propositions like meme theory as a replicator of culture, but still it's still at early stages and not as precise.
Yes, I mean, I'm very interested in cultural evolution, and I think the sorts of processes I was talking about would relate to that. So, for example, in the case of science, you could say, because we have ways of testing the models do indeed get better and better. So in that sense, they are evolving. And the meme theory is very interesting because, again, you could say it depends on, you have competitions between different theories. So, for example, I read a piece about, there was Newton versus Leibniz a long time ago about, and I don't remember this properly because I don't know the maths well enough, but are you dealing with infinitesimal quantities, or was there some other idea? And I think initially Newton's metaphor was dominant, but in the long run Leibniz's metaphor actually won out. So there are examples of these kinds of processes at work, but I'm not putting that very well. And you can certainly see this happening in vocabulary, so that new words are constantly entering the domain and slightly changing their meaning. So, for example, a most recent example of the term hallucinate, which previously were particularly related to problems in, say, mental illness like schizophrenia, that is, seeing things when there's nothing actually there. And it's now been it's entered the Oxford English Dictionary or something as applying to ChatGTP, which is where it means that ChatGTP is hallucinating when it makes up data or sources or something, which is rather different from the original meaning of hallucination. So you can see again a sort of cumulative change in how we talk about the world.
Do you think that, given that like consciousness exists within the culture and operates in relation to the culture, does it make artificial consciousness inconceivable theoretically? Is mind uploading possible, or is consciousness something tied to biology, a sort of biological naturalist point of view?
I don't think it's tied to biology in the sense of saying it has to be carbon-based. But I think it might be tied to biology in the sense that it has to have some basis. So I think human consciousness has evolved. So very early in the evolution of organisms, there were organisms that were not conscious. And people argue about when it emerges, is it in the Cambrian, or is it anyway, are all animals conscious, or are some animals conscious? And I would think that certainly some animals are conscious. But that's a special kind of consciousness, which is what you might call sentience. What humans have, as we were just talking about, is not only are you having subjective experience, but you can reflect on your subjective experience and you can talk to other people about it. Now, AI, I mean, certainly large language models have not evolved. They just have all this information put in at the top, as it were. So it's a bit like a human being who only has language and nothing else. So, and they don't have the underlying unconscious processes, which this is built on top of. So I think that large language models are probably not conscious, but I don't see any reason in principle why you shouldn't devise an AI that, because it has these lower level processes as well, and in particular is because of these lower level processes and sensations and so on and needed for action, it's very much tied to the real world. And we see that large language models are not tied to the real world, and that's why they can make things up, and in a sense they don't know that they're making things up. But we're constrained. I think what's in a sense biological is that we're constrained by the world we're in, by our genetics, by how our brain works. These are all important constraints that determine what emerges at the top end. So in that sense, it's biological.
To what extent is consciousness biological? There are some more exotic theories that, for example, Julian Jaynes claimed that before modern era, before ancient Greeks, during era of mythology, consciousness was not internal, but people actually hallucinated mythological characters and interacted with them. And then self-consciousness developed. So these kind of theories focus on culture. To what extent is not consciousness or sentience, but self-consciousness cultural? Or is it mostly evolved product of biology?
No, I think I would agree that the highest level, particularly the self-consciousness, probably is a cultural phenomenon. In fact, I've written about this with Cecilia Hayes and others. And there are interesting observations that may relate to this. So, for example, we all think we perceive the world in much the same way. But this is, in a sense, a cultural artifact, by which I mean we learn to see the world in the same way. And there are interesting observations that people who are born colourblind, for example, obviously don't see the world in the same way. People who are born, if that's the word, with synesthesia, don't see the world in the same way. But frequently they do not discover that they see the world in a different way until they're adults. So a friend of mine who is colourblind didn't know he was colourblind until he was in his 20s or something, working as a doctor, and they kept telling him, you're filling in the forms with the wrong colour. Only at that point did he. And we all, I've had experiences, if you give a lecture on synesthesia, which is where people most commonly see letters in colours or something, someone will come up afterward and say, I thought everybody was like that. So you have this interesting way in which culture makes us think we all see the world in the same way, in a sense makes us see the world in the same way. And this is good because it makes it easier to communicate with each other, and also makes us believe that there is a world out there that we're seeing. And there are other interesting observations, we call it signals from the deep. So there are signals coming up from our lower mind, as it were, which emerge into our consciousness, which are things like what's called perceptual fluency, which is how quickly, when you're shown an object, how quickly do you know what it is? The quicker, the more fluent that is. And there's a nice experiment not long ago where they showed people a whole series of rather tedious little pictures. I think they were all octagons or something. And then they show you them in pairs. So you see a new one and an old one. You have to say, which one did you see before? Or you have to say, which one do you prefer? And when they were asked which one did you see before, they were at chance because there was too many of them. When you asked them which one did you prefer, they preferred the one they had seen before. So the information that they had seen it before was there, it's been subsequently shown this is due to this perceptual fluency. People can rate how fluent their perception was. So they are aware of their perceptual fluency, but they misinterpret it as meaning liking rather than familiarity. So that's just one example of how these signals that come into your awareness can be reinterpreted depending on, again, from a cultural point of view. You could be trained to say, when it seems fluent, that means I've seen it before, sort of thing. And there's a more complicated experiment about ego depletion. You know about this? This is where...
I heard about it.
Yes, this is where if you have to exert your willpower to stop you eating this bit of cake as it's sitting on the table in front of you, you find it more difficult afterwards to do difficult cognitive tasks. That's ego, because the idea is willpower is like a muscle, it can be tired. But somebody did this nice experiment where they had one group who told, yes, willpower is like a muscle and it will be tired, and another group was told, if you have to do hard cognitive work, it actually energizes you and you're ready for doing more of it. And then that had exactly the effects you'd expect. So the people who had been told they'd be energized and be able to do more of it actually did better after they'd been not eating this cake. So again, that's another example of a signal, in this case, telling you how much cognitive effort you've been put in, being reinterpreted as a result of instructions from your culture, as it were. From that point of view, I can see how culture alters the way, at least, you interpret all these signals in your conscious experience. And it wouldn't surprise me, it seems to me perfectly plausible that in, the Greeks before the Odyssey or whatever it was, when they felt an urge to do something, they interpreted this is God telling me to do this, rather than we now think this is me telling me to do this, both of which are probably equally false.
How does culture influence mental disorders? When I studied psychiatry in med school, psychiatry was psychiatry in recent years tries to be more biological,
Yes.
Like the rest of medical disciplines, but it also delusions and hallucinations are derived from our culture content.
Yes.
Many people also worry that current environment, which affects our attention spans, how we receive information is like short. It also might affect our attention span and perhaps other cognitive abilities.
Yes, I'm not sure I believe about the attention span, but I certainly believe that culture has a very big role in mental disorders. I mean, there's the obvious point that in the olden days, when people had delusions of grandeur, they would claim to be Napoleon, whereas now presumably they would claim to be Trump or Putin or... So there's obviously a cultural effect there. But I'm particularly interested in what I was telling you about in relation to metacognition, that metacognition is critical, or this top level is critical for making us fit in with our culture. So we have the same model of the world as the people around us. And one idea in relation to, say, schizophrenia and having delusions, I mean, there's always, the striking thing about these delusions is that they are not altered by rational argument. You can say, you can't possibly believe this because of X, Y, and Z, and you're ignored. And they used to say, that's a sign of not being rational. And that's clearly wrong, because if anything, they're more rational than the rest of us and very good at arguing themselves in terms of this. But the new version is that the critical thing is that we have to have the same delusions as everybody else in our culture. And what they're missing is not that they have a delusion about the real world, it's that they more have a delusion about what most people think is the case in the real world. And this is a problem for psychiatrists, I know, because they would say somebody comes into your clinic from a very different culture, and they have to ask themselves the question, in our culture this would definitely be a delusion, but is it a delusion in their culture? Because if it's actually perfectly common in their culture, then it's not a delusion in the psychotic sense. So you have to go and ask the imam or whoever it is, or the rabbi, would this belief be normal in your culture? And they usually say, no, they're mad. But anyway, that's an interesting point. And so I think that what goes wrong is not that they're irrational, but they're no longer constrained by what other people in their culture think. And they can go off, their ideas can become more and more deviant because of this lack of constraint. And there's this very interesting phenomenon of folie à deux. You know about this, is where you have two people, usually husband and wife or something, and the idea is that one of them is psychotic and develops these erroneous beliefs, but takes the other one with them, so that the first one is no longer constrained and the other one is being constrained by their spouse. And they're typically also isolated, so they're less constrained. So that one of them, you could say, has the delusion because they're mad, and the other one has the delusion because of the influence of the their partner. And at least in some cases, when this is found out, the typical treatment is they have to be first separated. And then one of them has to be given antipsychotics, and the other one is just talked to and says, oh yes, gosh, that was a really stupid idea on that. So that's an interesting example of how this cultural mechanism might be relevant to that kind of psychosis. I mean, I suppose the problem with the internet is now people can create little bubbles, cultural bubbles as they were, so that you may find one cultural bubble that really is having bizarre beliefs, like being abducted by aliens or something, but it's not psychotic because they all believe it and they reinforce each other and they get isolated from other bubbles. So I can imagine, in fact, you can almost say that you can see this happening with all these conspiracy theories emerging, which I guess are examples of delusions.
Yeah, it's much easier to reinforce each other's illusions for people because of the internet.
But they're not mad.
One could argue that flat Earth theory is kind of it's more delusion than conspiracy. I mean, believing that Earth is flat. You know about flat Earth theory in USA? There is a number of people who believe that they are lying to us and the Earth is actually flat. That perhaps could be qualified as a delusion, not a conspiracy. There is like hard to classify.
Yeah, but I think you wouldn't, because there's a whole group of them, you wouldn't be able to say it's a psychotic delusion.
Nowadays, definition of mental disorders, I think, is growing. For example, nowadays, autism has become a spectrum, and many people have claimed that they have like weaker forms, like Asperger's, so-called. Are we perhaps too liberal with like definitions of mental disorders nowadays?
Yes, I certainly think that autism, and we've been recently thinking about autism because my wife has been involved in autism research more or less from the very beginning. And I think when she started, I never remember the terminology, the incidence or anyway, was something like 0.5% in 1,000, and it's now 10%. So there's been a huge increase, and that's mainly because it's not that there are more cases. It's the definition of autism has changed, as you said, and I think this is a very cultural phenomenon. And the first reason, so when it began, it was part of what they used to call mental deficiency. And then Asperger's syndrome came in, which said people can be autistic even though they're highly intelligent and verbally fluent. And at about the same time, the film Rain Man came out. Do you remember that film? Which had yes. And everybody, it was a very successful film, so nearly everybody had seen it, and they now had an idea that autism was autistic people had these savant abilities. They could have marvellous memories and all that sort of thing, which is actually only true for not more than 10% or something like that. So again, the cultural idea of what autism is like changed because of that. And since then, autistic characters appear in novels and films and TV series. It's like there was The Bridge. Did you see that? Which has it's a Scandinavian thing, but the main detective there is autistic. Actually, it never says that she's autistic, but everybody knows that she's autistic. And although, in spite of being very competent, and as you say, nowadays you can find online ways of saying, "Oh, are you autistic?" Here is a questionnaire you can fill in, so you can diagnose yourself as autistic. And for some people, at least, this seems a good thing to be, which is slightly surprising. And they say, "Yes, now that I know I'm autistic, I can understand why I'm like this and so on and so on." So that seems to be a very interesting cultural effect. And I think, though I know much less about this, that it's in general many more people are certainly now having mental problems, mental health problems, which are people we used to call the worried well. But now it's spread out, and students in particular.
Yeah, everyone claims to have ADHD.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. Or dyslexia, or I claim that I have, congenital laziness, so that should be taken account of.
I would like to know your opinion on two most popular theories of consciousness. There has been criticism of integrated information theory. Many scientists signed the petition that it should be considered pseudoscience. And also there is a global workspace theory, now called global neuronal workspace, and I would like to know your opinion about that theory too.
Well, I was involved in that controversy because I signed the letter saying that integrated information theory was pseudoscience. The first time I read about integrated information theory, I was struck by, they have 8 axioms? Is it 8? Anyway, I have a number of axioms.
I think 6 or 7, yeah. I'm not sure.
And which they say, this is the basis from which the theory has to be derived. This is what consciousness is. And I didn't agree with any of them. So that was slightly troubling, given that if you don't agree with the original axioms, then a theory that explains these axioms is not.
The axioms should be self-evident and not disagreeable in principle. Yes, if you like, it's not.
Yeah. So I think I'm a bit dubious about the whole idea of having self-evident axioms. And certainly I didn't agree with these. So that was a problem. And people cleverer than me say that IIT is actually a metaphysical theory, not a scientific one. Whereas global workspace theory has only emerged from, it's evolved. It was originally Bernard Barr's at a purely psychological level, and then Stan DeHaan enlarged it into a sort of neural story. And it's a very useful framework, as I would call it. You can do lots of little experiments to test aspects of it. So it's much more congenial to me because I'm basically an experimental psychologist, not a philosopher.
But does it address subjectivity, though? I think
that's a very good question. I'm not sure either of them. I'm not quite. Yes, I certainly would agree that with global workspace theory, you could say, why does it need to have subjective experience to get this broadcasting and so on? And IIT, I don't understand how it relates to subjective experience at all, but that's probably my failing. As we've already talked about, I think you can ask it in a sort of evolutionary terms of what is useful about subjective experience. And the most obvious thing is that it's jolly useful because we can talk to each other, which has all sorts of interesting advantages in group decision-making and developing models of the world. But obviously it didn't evolve for that purpose because that's not how evolution works. And I presume that this is an add-on to an earlier form of consciousness which didn't have this reflexive component. So I would be very interested in discovering what advantages does subjective experience give you in dealing with the world? And there are various ideas about this. I'm particularly interested, there's a distinction between model-free learning and model-based learning. And I'm wondering if model-based learning, as soon as you have a model of the world which is different from the world, is that subjective experience? And that's my sort of feeling at the moment, but I don't know how you would take that further.
It depends how we define probably subjectivity, because on one hand, if you have individual ontology, like you have model, internal model.
Yeah.
One might claim it's subjectivity, but also some people who agree with like hard problem of consciousness think that subjectivity is experientiality and qualia.
Yeah.
But what possible evolutionary advantage could subjectivity have? I don't agree with the epiphenomenalist view that it's just a byproduct. It should serve some purpose, evolutionarily or otherwise.
There's I don't know whether there's this book by Hakwan Lau.
In Consciousness We Trust. Yeah, you recommended it actually.
And he has a very interesting discussion of qualia, which I like, but I don't know whether it really gets there, but this is, and it's interesting to me because philosophers for a long time have said, what do you mean by qualia? And they say, what is it like to experience red or something? And Hakwan puts this in, at least makes me think about it in a different way. So you can say, what is red like? Mm-hmm. It's a bit like orange, and it's less like yellow, and it's not at all like blue. And this is, in a sense, Hakwan's idea, because you have a colour space in which which has, you can do it with only two dimensions. I think there's a sort of red, green, and a yellow, blue, and any colour can be put into this space. And indeed, you can say red isn't here because it's a bit like this and it's less like that, so that's where it should be. And this is computationally a great advantage because it gets an enormous amount of information into a small space and allows you, even if you have 3 colour receptors, you can nevertheless build this thing up. And he gives, as a counterexample, the mantis shrimp, which I can't remember, has something like 13 different colour receptors, and they're just categorical, so it can't put them together. So that's a sort of advantage of a system in this way, and whether that, and certainly if you think of qualia as not what it's like to see red, but what is red like, that seems to me to make us beginnings of a story. So I say mantis shrimps are not conscious.